Good afternoon, UX New Zealand 2020. Thanks for having us again this year. And thank you so much to the wonderful organisers and sponsors for putting together another fantastic conference. While we both wish we could be there in Wellington with you, we're coming to you from the suburbs of Melbourne. Don't hold that against us, please. And we're here today to talk to you about service design and Agile, the odd couple. Now, it's a little bit of an understatement, but hasn't 2020 been a cracker? It's a year that started out with a lot of hope and optimism, but as the year draws to a close, I think a lot of us are feeling a little more like this.
Now, for us, like a lot of you here, I'm sure, it's been a year of constant change. Both Gareth and I have gone from working in an office every day to being 100% remote, working from home. We've had jobs fall through, a redundancy, and contracts terminated early. Not to mention all the stress and anxiety of living through what the UN have now labelled the greatest crisis of our age. Now, we've started new roles and we face the challenge of joining teams through a laptop screen, having never stepped foot through the office door. It's meant learning how to build working relationships with new colleagues in a whole new way, and developing new ways of working with new tools as companies have scrambled to reshape the way that they do business as quickly as possible. And you know what? We actually think that in many ways, this has been one of the best years of our careers. The changes and forced rethink about the way that we approach and do our work in the face of COVID has not just been challenging, but actually quite liberating and refreshing in ways that we hadn't even considered. It's caused us, like many, to rapidly react and at the same time reflect on how we used to work previously through fresh eyes. I'm sure it's been stressful, but the rate of change and innovation through having our hands forced has actually been incredible. As futurist Steve Sammartino puts it, it's like nothing happens in decades, and then decades happen in days.
Now, before we get into some thoughts on service design, let's introduce ourselves. So I'm Gareth Roberts, and I've been working in UX and service design for over a decade. And I've had the privilege of working with a bunch of great companies in both the US and Australia. And more recently, I've started my own consultancy, Insight Studios, here in Melbourne.
And I'm Ben. I've been working in UX for over 20 years in the UK and Australia for companies like the British Museum and Origin Energy. I founded and ran a UX agency in Melbourne for 10 years called Thirst Studios, and I've more recently returned to independent consulting. Now, we're here today to talk to you about service design in Enterprise Agile and how we feel that it's never quite worked together as well as it could, and how things have had to change quickly in the face of COVID, and how we feel that some of the shifts in thinking and ways of working as a result of the crisis could and probably should be here to stay.
But before we get into that, let's first recap on what service design and Agile are and how they work or don't work together. In general terms, service design is the process of coordinating an organisation's resources, people, services and products in order to deliver services and products to customers and clients. Unlike UX, which is typically focused on a single touch point or interaction, service design looks more broadly at an entire service ecosystem and includes designing and streamlining everything involved in providing services across all channels and touch points, from the behind-the-scenes employee experience to the systems that support them to the public-facing and customer experience. And in terms of Agile, Atlassian explains it really quite nicely as an iterative approach to project management and software development that helps teams deliver value to their customers faster and with fewer headaches. Instead of betting everything on a big bang launch, Agile teams deliver work in small but consumable increments. Requirements, plans, and results are evaluated continuously, so teams have a natural mechanism for responding to change quickly.
Now, in our experiences, Service design in enterprise agile environments typically runs in a sort of waterfall-like sprint zero scenario, where designers go deep into a research phase to understand and map out the problem space ahead of delivery teams starting their work, identifying challenges and then proposing and iterating on solutions before they're framed into agile delivery sprints. Now, research is often extensive, lengthy, and costly, and requires significant lead time before the test and learn process can begin. And while this has worked to varying levels of success in the past, neither Gareth or I have ever quite felt that the relationship between service design and agile was quite as good as it could be. In our experience, it operates a bit like pass the parcel rather than being fully integrated, often actually limiting the chance to be truly agile and pivot as we learn more through the development phases. This is in part due to the rigid, polished blueprints that rarely get revisited after they've been produced. And with the onset of COVID in 2020, however, service design has been faced with a bunch of challenges that it's never had to deal with before. With social distancing, lockdowns, and everything else that came with it, a bunch of new business challenges have appeared overnight. Now, these challenges have been particularly evident across the retail sector, where Gareth is currently working, with significant issues across all channels, from staff and customer experiences in stores to the back-end ordering systems and the entire supply chain. And without the usual runway for research in the face of such big changes, service designers faced a dilemma. Do we just drop into delivery mode and build isolated solutions to patch these now broken service models? Or do we embrace a new model for service design, where we can truly embed a much more lean approach within agile sprints?
The speed of change during COVID and the huge levels of uncertainty, coupled with the sheer numbers of challenges and problems it threw up, meant that there was just simply no time to do things the way we've done them in the past. There was no time to pause business as usual to allow us time to retool and relaunch services. We needed to work out how to deliver end-to-end design thinking in real time, and we needed it fast. And so, while COVID has had many impacts on our work and our lives, it's actually offered unique opportunities to try some new approaches. And while you may be forgiven for thinking that Agile and service design are like chalk and cheese from the way we've been talking, where one's about going fast and getting to an MVP, and the other's about being slow and more strategic, I actually like to think of them more like chili and chocolate. They seem like they shouldn't work together, but in the right amounts they actually do. And done right, the results can be quite unique and even better than the sum of their parts. Now, this isn't just theory, and it can work. For the past 9 months, I've had the opportunity to help a leading retailer change their way of working to embrace service design within their enterprise agile model. And while it's had its challenges and its ups and downs like everything in 2020, it's actually worked beautifully. And it's evident that COVID has challenged Australian and New Zealand retailers like never before. The shutting of business doors for months completely changed the way we do business and caused massive disruption to the retail sector. Businesses needed to adapt quickly to survive, yet alone thrive in 2020. In moving to contactless service models, many had to rely on dated e-commerce platforms that just weren't designed as the sole touchpoint of a brand. And on the surface of it, it seems like that in 2020, we should have had the tools necessary at our disposal to handle COVID. And yes, lots of companies with online presences could still sell products, and lots of companies were still shipping products to customers too. But for many in retail, reality was very different. Remember, services aren't a single touch point like a website, and your end-to-end service experience depends on a whole group of actors, some that are in your control, but importantly, some that aren't. In the face of so many issues facing retail this year, things needed to change and needed to change fast. And without knowing how customers and suppliers would react, we were faced with so many unknowns. For example, how could websites handle unforeseen traffic volumes? And how can we pick and pack orders in a socially distanced warehouse? How could companies work with shipping carriers that were all changing their service models and practices overnight too? Some of whom were now under lockdown or had their own massive COVID challenges. And how could we sign for delivery consignment paperwork without touching a pen? And how do you ensure availability of products with massive international shipping disruptions?
And of course, it isn't just problems across the business and its customers that needed to be solved. Us designers have been impacted pretty significantly too, by changes brought about by being locked down and needing to work remotely. All of a sudden, we're not able to get together in the same room to run workshops. We can't bring customers in to do research. We can't do co-design sessions, and we can't gather around a computer with the development team. And while 3M are probably not quite so happy about the drop in sales of Post-it notes, thankfully, we've all been able to adapt fairly easily with online collaboration tools like Zoom and Miro, which we're going to talk about more in a second. But possibly more importantly, we've also had to learn how to get lean and strategically embrace the ambiguity, to go with the flow, as it were. In many ways, I think we've all learned to operate more like a startup might, working with very little time and having to constantly adapt to change. And a big learning for both Gareth and I in terms of working fast and adapting to change has been the realization that there simply hasn't been time to do things like carefully define an ideal end state and document it in a beautiful blueprint, and then meticulously work backwards to define the roadmap to get there. Instead, we've needed to quickly adapt on the fly, developing a more flexible co-design approach that could easily change if necessary as we constantly refine the backlog. One of the things we've both found particularly necessary has been to zoom out and look more broadly across projects with a bird's eye view from end to end, working out the high priority, well-defined elements that delivery teams could get up and running with straight away, to then effectively buy our design teams time during the subsequent sprints so that we could dig into research and design activities to better define the more ambiguous, tricky product and service problems that needed to be solved. And we've come to think of this approach as just-in-time service design. And so what we'd like to share with you now are our 6 key elements of just-in-time service design that we've found really useful as we've been tackling problems over the course of the last 9 months or so. Now, while these are things that have worked for us during the crazy COVID times, we actually think that they're useful little nuggets that we will continue doing as we transition back into normal in the months and years to come. And so without further ado, here's number 1. Embrace constraints. Now this year, probably more than any other year in our careers, it's been all about constraints, extreme constraints of time, budgets, and geography. And while it's quite common for designers to complain about these sorts of things, in the case of COVID, there simply hasn't been time to grumble. We've just had to accept the challenges and work out solutions as quickly as possible with no other option. What's actually been really interesting is how these sudden unforeseen constraints have led to some really interesting innovations and pivots happening in businesses across the globe. And like with any puzzle, the more complex it is, then the more rewarding it is to solve. Finding solutions that work for a complex set of constraints forces you to think differently, think laterally, and approach problems from alternative angles. So once you see the constraint as a challenge and not a blocker, designing solutions can be very rewarding, and it's often the point at which truly great innovation happens. So instead of feeling dispirited by constraints, embrace them as the challenge that they are. Constraints are actually what design is all about.
Now, number 2, get lean. Now, it feels as if traditionally, lean has been seen as a true 4-letter word in service and experience design. It's seen as incomplete or lacking or compromised. However, with a bit of a change of perspective, this doesn't need to be the case. In our world, lean should mean efficient. It means doing just enough research to give us the context of the key challenges that we're tackling. And that could be the difference between talking to a handful of users versus a dozen. It could be tapping into users through a survey instead of interviews. It's whatever allows us to get the context we need in the shortest amount of time. And it also means just enough design. Too often, we're caught in the loop of designing out every single screen of a product for our development teams, when we could just design one template and provide context in how it's going to be used in many ways. And that saves everyone time. It also means trading some documentation with real conversations with your developers, instead of writing out those massive documents. Talk to your devs as each story is picked up and help them understand how you pictured a scenario working. Remember, sometimes less is actually more. We've also had to relook at one of the fundamentals of service design, the service blueprints. Number 3, adaptable blueprints. With the constraints of this year being what they are, we've both learned to let go of the long Sprint Zero research phase and the beautiful service design blueprints of the past. Instead, we've both started using a more lean, no-frills blueprint model, co-designed in real time with the project team, that can evolve and change over the course of a project. And we've found getting the key project team involved in the co-design really helps get everyone on the same page earlier and to feel some ownership of the service ecosystem that we create together. And that leads to better service design decisions and a more consistent experience for all end users. And that's a big win in Enterprise Agile.
Unlike many design teams, we've made the move to Miro for a huge number of activities, including not just service blueprinting, but workshops and co-design sessions and things like that as well. We've found that the tool lends itself really nicely to producing service blueprints, particularly as a group activity. And we'd argue that the process of producing, discussing and editing blueprints in Miro over the course of a project actually makes for a much better process than the old one that we used to follow.
Now, number 4, get creative with research. Research is such a vital part of the experience and service design process, and no one can argue that. But depending on your approach, it can take a lot of time, and time was just not something we had a lot of this year. This year, we had to get creative to get the answers we needed. Where we once may have implemented multiple rounds of user interviews or usability sessions, we've had to make do with group discussions over Zoom, or surveys, or other things that can be completed asynchronously. I've also started collecting user feedback using the Project Miro board, where the entire project team can see and be more closely involved and add their thoughts and experience too in real time. A key thing to embrace here is that it's okay to get lean. Talk to as many primary sources as you can, but if that's not possible, secondary sources like your front of house staff, your contact center agents, or your experienced colleagues can really help. So instead of trying to get all the answers up front, dig into some of those research activities that will help clarify some of the biggest challenges you face. Share those findings with your team in a lean way. Design your solution based on these assumptions, and then test it in the real world. Nothing beats testing in the real world with real users on a real product.
Now, another key learning for us, both through this crisis, has been not to waste energy on things that you have very little control over. Accept that certain elements of the planning, research, design, and delivery may not be perfect or exactly as you'd first imagined. So number 5 is let it go. In our experience, it's far better that you're on the journey and that progress is being made, that you're moving towards an end goal, than it is spending time worrying and striving perfection, or worse still, nothing being done at all. Now, we're not suggesting for a moment that you shouldn't care, far from it, but learn to accept that sometimes good enough might just be good enough in the whole broader scheme of things. Now, we're not suggesting for a moment that you should let mediocre always be the acceptable end state either. As well as letting things go, you should also fight for your right to iterate, which is number 6. Now, arguably, one of the drawbacks of lean service design in Agile is that you only have so much time to frame your design before a release needs to happen. In theory, you'll then test and learn and iterate on that design over time. But in our experiences, all too often, companies will deliver that MVP and then just move on to the next thing and never actually make time to come back to it with enhancements. In doing this, companies might certainly launch products that solve problems, but they're not always delivering a consistent, ideal service experience. The best brands do have consistency and flow across channels, across their services, and this is something worth fighting for. Now, you may not win those initial iteration conversations, but the key here is to document your rationale for the improvements and illustrate the need for enhancements. Create an experience debt register and share it as widely as possible with your project team and stakeholders in exactly the same way that tech debt might be handled. Now, you may also want to back your hypothesis with data to build and support that argument that you present to leadership. And that will ensure that it gets the proper consideration that it needs. As we all know, business decisions are often made on data and dollars. So it'll help if you can show how this enhancement to the experience is going to benefit the business and not just the customer. Now, there's a great article on this very subject on Jakob Nielsen and Don Norman's NN Group website that talks about identifying, prioritizing, capturing and tracking UX debt. And it's well worth a read. There's some great ideas on there about how to measure the expected severity of an issue using a matrix like this one that you can see here, and how best to make the case for why certain issues might warrant resolution over others. And it also suggests things like ways to pay down the debt in subsequent sprints.
And so we've come full circle. Are service design and Agile the odd couple? No, they certainly don't have to be. And here are our tips again for helping you on your service design in Enterprise Agile journey. Number 1, embrace constraints. It's the name of the game. Number 2, get lean. Just enough can be enough. 3, adaptable blueprints. Let go of pixel perfect and co-design blueprints with your team. 4, be flexible with research. Sometimes you can get the answers you need in other ways. 5, let it go. You don't need perfection on your first pass, and nothing is ever perfect, and that's okay. And finally, 6, fight for your right to iterate. Build your business case and strive to constantly improve services and products. Now that brings us to the end of our talk here today. We'd like to thank UX New Zealand for having us and everyone here, of course, and we hope you all enjoy the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.